Hello and good evening. My name is Lauren Rue. I am the Vice President of Marketing and Development at Cornerstone Family Healthcare. I just wanted to take a minute to thank you all for being here tonight. I see a lot of you in the back. I promise that nobody bites. If you want to move up a little bit closer, we don't all have to sit right next to each other, but I do think it might be a little bit more of an intimate experience. No pressure, but feel free to come up. You're all welcome to join us here. But I just wanted to say thank you for being here. I see a lot of people who have attended the first and the second sessions. I see some new faces who are here for the first time this evening. I think you'll all have a great experience and walk away with some new tools for your toolbox, whether or not you're learning to cope with grief for yourself or to empower us on our journeys as we care for the community and help them through their particular grief journeys. So there's a few people who have partnered together through this coalition: Cornerstone Family Healthcare, Mount St. Mary's, Montefiore St. Luke's Cornwall Hospital. Thank you to our hosts at Mount St. Mary's. Let's give them a round of applause. Really, we would not be here if they did not have all of the logistical backing. Deb, I don't know if she's in the room, but you are a miracle worker. So thank you for all of that. I think just one real quick note, the Kaplan Family Foundation also makes a lot of this happen, but it's because of their belief. Yeah, that gets a round of applause too. In the good work of the people who are here in this room and the understanding that these are tools that we really need. As a coalition, it's really important for us to continue these conversations. So as the event ends, please come up to us, let us know. We want to hear from you. What else do you want to hear? What other types of workshops? So we're all ears. But thank you again for being here this evening. And now I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Force.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening and welcome. My name is Larry Force, and I'm a professor of psychology here. And along with my dear friend and colleague, Jeff Kahana, we run a Center on Aging and Disability Policy. As I look out, what? You can't, how's that? Better? How's that? How's that? That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Please. So as I look out here tonight, it looks like a who's who of who's who. And on behalf of Father Greg, we welcome you to Mount St. Mary College. The Kaplan Family Foundation, we are here today because of a vision driven by a thought and action. And it's because of the Kaplan Family Foundation that we now gather for our fourth No Boundaries event. You know, I mean, look around. It's because of the Kaplan Family Foundation, their fingerprints and heart and support, you know, we are here this evening. Lauren Rue, she's the Vice President of Marketing for Cornerstone. David Jolly, the CEO, absolutely knows what we now all know, that Lauren is a professional among professionals, and her skills have led the way. You've heard the name Deb Meisner. We wouldn't be seeing each other, hearing each other, tasting food with each other if it wasn't for Deb Meisner and the logistics that she, you know, put together to make this all happen. She's been so dependable and at all of these events, and without her, we'd be sitting here in the dark. Along with acknowledgement to Deb, Susan Waxman on Joan's staff has been taken a personal lead in helping to materialize this event. Our VPs are present, Dr. Evan Merkenkoff, Michael Fox, Nikki Calabron, our VP of Development. Tony Spano, you know, from our IT. With his wizardry, he has made this presentation and video seamless. And Lou Russo and staff from Parkhurst have been unbelievable in providing the food. Kathy Barton helped set up the room arrangements for this. And Lee Ferris, as you see him floating around taking tremendous pictures. Our partners in this collaboration are David Jolly and Cornerstone Family Health, Dan Mon, the CEO of Montefiore, and Margaret Allers being here tonight. We appreciate that. Ron Calavito, the CEO of Access. I'd also like to recognize and welcome Kate McSweeney, the CEO of Access, a national lobby group in Washington. And Kate has joined us from Washington, D.C., and she's been an integral partner and friend for Jeffrey and I in our proactive caring program. So Kate, welcome. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Ken Doka. So sit back and give me about a day and a half. All right. I'm not going to read all of his bio. He asked me not to, because if I did, it would probably take me a day and a half. He's a professor emeritus of the College of New Rochelle and a senior vice president for grief programs for Hospice Foundation of America. He's one of the authors of the text Dying and Death, Life and Living. I have a number of students here tonight, and as I told you, Ken is the co-author of our textbook. He's a prolific author. Ken has either co-authored or authored independently over 54 books. He's a serious writer, and he has a lot to say, and people know him not only locally, but nationally and internationally. Dr. Doka is editor of both Omega and the Journal of Death and Dying and Journeys, a newsletter to help in bereavement. He has an ongoing blog for Psychology Today entitled Good Morning. Dr. Doka was elected president of the Association for Death Education and Counseling in the early 90s, board of directors of the International Work Group on Education and Counseling, and it goes on and on and on. Dr. Doka has keynote conferences throughout North America, as well as Europe, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. He participates in the annual Hospice Foundation of America teleconference and has appeared on CNN and Nightline. In addition, he has served as a consultant to medical, nursing, funeral service, and hospice organizations, as well as businesses and education and social service agencies. Dr. Doka is an ordained Lutheran minister. But beyond the titles, he is a dear friend. He hired me when I was 23 years old to teach as an adjunct for my first class at Concordia College. And then I followed him to the College of New Rochelle. And throughout my life, Ken has been a dear friend. He lives in Dutchess County. And I think that's really the most important title for me, that Dr. Doka is a dear friend. Please.
Thank you very much.
Let me introduce Dr. Doka, and this is where he usually goes into his opening statement about some people make mistakes. Some people make mistakes, like when he hired me for the first time at the age of 23.
And I repeated the mistake at the College of New Rochelle. Thank you, Larry, and I want to thank everyone here for being here today. My son has a much briefer introduction. One time I took him on a trip with me when he was in college, and I was speaking at a conference, and he decided to come to the conference, and he heard the introduction similar to Larry's, and he said, "Dad, you know, and your kids don't always know what you do, right?" And he looked at me and he said, "Dad," he said, "that was an impressive introduction." I said, "Thank you, son. Thank you, Mike." He said, "You know what it means? It means you have no life." So I guess you can look at that in a number of different ways. In any way, I'm honored and delighted to be with you today. I want to add my thanks to Access, to Cornerstone, to Montefiore, of course, to the Kaplan Family Foundation, for Mount St. Mary, and particularly the Center for Aging and Disability Policy. Thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful experience for me. Now that I've retired, I enjoy the opportunity to lecture every once in a while. So it's been good. My son, by the way, says I'm flunking retirement. Today we're going to shift gears a little bit from the other lectures where we talked about the pain and possible complications of grief and its various different permutations. And we're going to look really at that grief can sometimes be a way to test our resilience and a way to empower growth. And let me begin. Any of you in the audience ever been a spelunker? Any of you ever gone caving? Spelunking? No, we don't seem to have a large crowd of spelunkers here. I saw a hand up there? Yes? What's that? Very briefly. Well, let me explain about caving to you. Caves are made, especially in the Northeast, in this section of the country, most of the country, by limestone going through and wearing down rock. So caves are muddy and caves are wet. I have one son, as I told you. I have a couple of godchildren. Scott here is the only one I could ever go into a cave with me. So he went on a couple of caving trips with me. And this is at the very beginning of the cave. By the end of the cave, Scott was caked with mud. And you know, and when you go through a cave, you have to do some squatting and some crawling, and even some slithering through tight passages, usually with a few inches of water on the bottom of it in mud. So we're going to have a sign-up sheet for the next caving trip, okay? And Larry's going to lead you on that trip, so you can sign up at the information desk at the end of this. So as I said, this is at the beginning. It's not clean. So we get to a point in this cave where there's a place called the Pinch. Now remember, this was Scott's first caving trip. I think he was about 10 or 11 years old at the time. And we get to a place at the end of the cave called the Pinch. And it looks like you're going through this cave, and you now can stand up. And it looks like it ends with a pond, you know, like kind of a little pond of water there. But actually, it's called the Pinch. And when you go through the water, under the water, about 18 inches under the water, is another passage that gets you to the other side and the end of the cave. And you have to essentially hold your breath for about 3 feet, go through this totally submersed passage to get to the other side. So he was a little bit nervous, as you can imagine. And we talked about it, and I said, Scott, if you don't want to go, I'll take you to the other side. We'll go back the way we came in. You won't have to go through the Pinch. But the whole caving group was going through the Pinch, and Scott thought about it for a minute, kind of swallowed hard and said, let's just do it. And so he got through the Pinch, and of course I wanted to bolster his ego and bolster his bravery, reinforce that, and I said, that was incredibly brave of you. I said, I know it was very tough for you, and I'm really glad you did it. And Scott turned to me and he said, this is one of the things my dad always talks about. And while I was good friends with his father, you know, his youngest son was, as I said, my godson, I didn't understand the reference. And I never heard his father talk something that might be applicable. And I said, what does your father say, Scott? And he says, my dad says, there are some circumstances in life we either have to grow up or grow down. It's going to change you. You have to grow up or grow down. And I always thought about that comment because grief is one of those moments. When you experience a serious loss, it's going to change you. You have no choice about the change. The choice you have is whether you're going to grow up or grow down. A few cartoons illustrate that. I love this cartoon. Relax, honey, change is good. Not always, right? But sometimes it is. Don't stare to a wreck. You want to grow up like that? So evolution takes a positive turn. And sometimes you just don't know. The hospital said your mother's condition is satisfactory, but they didn't. So the question before us today is, can grief be an impetus to new growth? And if it can be, how can we facilitate that? And how can we differentiate the transformation that grief can sometimes create in our lives? Also talk about resilience too. Loss, as we said, like Scott understood, is a transforming event. You know, there's the old saying, I don't know if it's true, but that the symbols for crisis in the Chinese know this for sure, really are the symbols for both challenge and opportunity. Things are going to be different now. But how are they going to be different? In Celtic mythology, thin places are places where the boundaries between this world and the other world are permeable. In a sense, grief is one of those things. It throws everything offside. And this is very evident in the work of Calhoun and Tedeschi. Calhoun and Tedeschi say that significant and traumatic losses are events that not only cause emotional distress, and they do, but they challenge one's beliefs, one's goals, one's personal narrative. And when you go through these events, life is now divided as before and after. It's going to be different now. It's going to be different now. One of the things we talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, what happens is as a result of a traumatic event, we lose a sense of what we call our assumptive world. We like to think that the world is safe, benevolent, and predictable. We all have our plans for tonight, right? My plan is probably similar to most of your plans. Maybe some of the students here may have somewhat different plans. But my plan tonight is to linger a little bit in the reception, probably be the last person out or one of the last people out, because I look forward to those opportunities to chat with you. And then I'm going to go home, and I'll feed my cat, who'll be very annoyed that she wasn't fed until now. And then I'll probably relax, pour a drink and another glass of wine, and just relax and watch some mindless TV until it's ready to go, until it's time to go to bed. Probably pretty soon by the time I get back. But imagine, and your plans are probably not that dissimilar, and we all assume that they'll take place without interruption. But sometimes our assumptive world is challenged. There's a traumatic event, an accident, a disaster, a difficulty. And our assumptions about the world, safe, predictable, benevolent, are deeply challenged. And this can result in post-traumatic stress disorder, or what Calhoun and Tedeschi called post-traumatic growth. In fact, sometimes they're not necessarily opposite solutions or opposite outcomes. Sometimes we can even arise from post-traumatic stress and actually have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and still in the end come out with post-traumatic growth. Let me tell you a little bit about Catherine Sanders. Now I'm going to show my age, okay? And I'm going to let some of you show your age. How many of you remember the old TV series, I Led 3 Lives? Okay. Not too many hands up. This was a classic McCarthy-era television show in the 1950s. And the character on I Led 3 Lives was a character who was, by all appearances, a regular American business person. But in reality, he was a member of the Communist Party. But in truth, he was an infiltrator from the FBI. And so every week, was it an hour or a half hour? Do you remember? I think it was a half hour too. Every year, for every episode for a half hour, we'd see him foil some nefarious plot against the United States by the Communist Party USA, in league with the Russians and the Chinese, of course. And then his goal was to foil the plot without exposing his identity. So that was the whole plot of every episode. Don't know how many years it lasted. Well, Catherine Sanders actually did lead 3 very distinct lives. First, she was a high fashion model. And to the end of her life, you could see that residue beauty even as she got into her 80s. She was an incredible woman and an incredibly beautiful one. She actually told me one time she spent New Year's Eve with Howard Hughes one year on a date, just to give you a sense of her experience. And I told her this happened to be a New Year's Eve of 2000, where she came down to meet me, and we were going to a colleague's millennial party. And I said, this has got to be bad for your life review. You're spending 1 year celebrating New Year's with Howard Hughes, and then 50 years later, you're with Ken Doka. This cannot be good. She was lovely, though. Then she fell in love with a dashing Coast Guard captain by the name of Herschel Sanders. And she married Herschel Sanders and became a military wife for the second phase of her life. And she lived on military bases, Coast Guard bases, which naturally are on the coast. And when she was at a Coast Guard base in Pensacola, Florida, literally as she watched on shore, she saw her 14-year-old son, Jimmy, water skiing. And a boat got between him and his toe. And literally as she watched on shore, she saw Jimmy crash into that boat, and it was immediately killed. And that began her third life. She was going to college at that point in time as an adult with the sole reason that I want to continue to help my kids with their homework as they were approaching their teens. And then she decided to study grief and loss. Now, this was in the late 1960s, and so to study grief and loss, you could probably read just about everything that had been written in probably a day and a half, literally. And of course, when Jimmy died, she decided that she wanted to go on to graduate school and study grief and bereavement and do research on it. And she became one of the pioneers in the field. And she did one of the first empirical studies of grief, where she studied both grieving parents and widows. And she came with an empirically based notion that looked at grief as having a series of phases. And she said the first phase is one of shock. You know, you're just stunned by what happened. Doesn't matter if a death was sudden, or what we might call sudden and traumatic, like the death of her son. Or, you know, I always love, when I quoted this earlier outside, what a colleague of mine, Therese Rando, reminds us, is that for most people die of sudden deaths. Some in hospice care, some out of chronic illness. But most of us look at death as being not when we expected it, even in hospice situations. And then she says, as the shock recedes, there's a tremendous awareness of loss. And did in her study is she developed a scale to measure the intensity of grief that was called the Grief Experience Inventory, the Sanders Grief Experience Inventory, which is still used in the field. And here the scores were very, very high. People had intense grief, and it was evident in their scores. And then she said they go into a phase called conservation withdrawal. And what she means by that is that for all possible appearances, the person is back to normal. Looks like it anyway. They're back at work, they're back at school, they're doing whatever they used to do, they're fulfilling their key roles. But she says, and the scores are somewhat less elevated than they were in that earlier phase, but they still show a deep intensity of grief. The person's still grieving. And when you ask the people how they're doing, they'll say, it takes all my energy just to get through the day. I have nothing left. You know, they're going through the motions. And she says somewhere in that period, people are going to have to deal with three choices. Some of them will choose to die. Now, I don't mean necessarily that they die by suicide, but often they neglect their health, they neglect their diet, they find difficulty sleeping. And again, we know the high mortality rate, particularly in older widows and widowers, within a year after the loss. Others, they just maintain the status quo. They can function now, and that's what they want out of life. A number of years ago, I had a client who illustrated this well. She was a woman who came to me for counseling because her sister had died. And she had a tremendously close relationship with her sister. They were close from children, and now they were in their 40s and 50s. And they had lived together. They stayed in their mother's house when their mother died. They continued to live together. They enjoyed life together. They'd go on trips together. They just had a wonderfully warm sibling relationship. And when her sister died of a brain aneurysm, unexpected and suddenly, she went into counseling. And after a while, she said to me, she said, when my sister was alive, I felt my life was like watching a color TV show. It was vivid, it was bright, had a lot of fun. We really enjoyed each other's company. We enjoyed our friends together. We enjoyed our trips together. And she said when she died, it was like somebody pulled the plug out of the TV and the screen went blank. And she said, I've appreciated what you've done for me. She said, and now the TV's back on. It's black and white. So I think I'm ready to leave counseling. And I looked at her and I said, we can get the color back. And she looked at me, and I'll never forget what she said. And she said, to do so would be a betrayal of my sister. In other words, if I lived a life as satisfying, as happy as it was without her, it minimizes her role and her position in my life. And she terminated therapy. Got a Christmas card from her every year, but she never went back into therapy. And others will say, no, I want the color back. I want to have a life now changed, but one that's going to be very meaningful still. And Sanders said, many times those people make that choice, and they can really talk about it in terms of, how did she put it? She said they can really talk about it in terms of almost a life-changing experience, of an event that was often the turning point for them. One example that she gives in her book, one of the case anecdotes that she gives in her book, is a woman who lost her husband some 6 years before. And she was in this sort of phase of just sort of coping with life. And every time her granddaughter and her daughter lived very close, and every day they'd visit her. And every day when she saw her 5-year-old granddaughter, she'd start crying and she'd say, if only Anthony were here to see her. He would find such a kick out of having her. And she would start crying that Anthony couldn't see his wonderful grandchild, his wonderful granddaughter. And then she said one day, she told Catherine, that as I heard them walk out the house, there was an open window, and the little girl looked at her mother, this woman's daughter, and says, Mommy, is that all Grandma does? She just cries. And the mother said, the older woman said, the widow said, all of a sudden it struck me. I don't want to be remembered by my granddaughter as the grandma who always cried. And she said, I need to do something different. And that was her turning point. And she said, for those people who do that, that's an experience of renewal. They come out a different person. They're still dealing, of course, with the loss, and we always keep a continuing bond with the deceased, and we always, have them in our lives in our own way. But I want to live a life that continues to be significant, despite the loss that I experienced. And later in her life, Catherine and I started writing together, and we wrote a piece on the sixth phase of Catherine's work, which she called fulfillment. That here, you've not only renewed your life after the loss, but the loss in its own way sort of has transformed you in a way that you hadn't expected, much like it did with Catherine. And it seems that as much as you miss the person who died, that is the event that's been a turning point in your life. Catherine used an illustration to explain that to me as we talked about it. She said that one of the stories that helped me, she said, as I was at a sermon, she went to this local church, said I was at this sermon, and this pastor talked about a trip that he had taken to Pakistan, India and Pakistan. And he said that one of the places we stopped at in the tour was this place where they made these huge, what we used to call oriental carpets or multi-pattern carpets. And she said she would watch, he would watch them, and there were all these people independently weaving. And these were the huge carpets you would use for hotels or these tremendous venues where there was a lot of room. And she said, when we went there was somebody sitting on a kind of balcony, kind of overlooking, and there were these little boys who were running up and down, giving instructions. And this person said to the host, "What's going on here? What am I missing?" And he said, "Well, what you're seeing up there is the master carpet maker. He's in charge of ultimately the carpet. And what he's doing is whenever he notices a mistake, it's interwoven into the carpet. So, so he's constantly giving instructions if somebody makes a mistake in the pattern, that mistake is to be repeated." And she said, that was a good illustration of, I think, my life in grief. That, that the death of my son really changed the pattern of my life. But the pattern now is a very interesting and very fulfilling one. Not that I'd ever want my son to die. Not that I ever had a choice. We don't have those choices. But we do have choices about what we're going to do with it. And that's what's interesting, what I call the mysterious math of grief. Sometimes losses diminish us. Sometimes losses extinguish us. But sometimes losses can be a source of growth. A couple of studies. A number of years ago, Eisenstadt did a famous study with his associates called Parental Loss and Achievement. And he did some case studies of a number of people who had experienced in early childhood the loss of a father, a significant figure in their life. One of them was Otto von Bismarck. Another one was Bill Clinton. And as he looked at these people, he said, while a lot of kids are devastated by the loss of their father figure, these people, it became a motivation for power. It was like feeling powerless, feeling lonely. They kind of vowed to themselves, I will never be in that vulnerable position again. And it actually was a factor in the tremendous success and achievements that they accomplished. Another study was by Calhoun and Tedeschi called Blooming Widows. And this was a study that showed widows who are socially constrained. In other words, sometimes this is misquoted as widows do better when their husband dies. That's not what the study said. Okay? It said a certain group of widows, many of whom were sort of socially constrained, do this, don't do that, really sort of controlled by their spouses. All of a sudden, when their spouse died, found that they had to rely on themselves more than they had. And as they did that, their own self-esteem increased and their own comfort level increased. I had one woman whose husband, for example, hated to travel, didn't want to go anywhere when it wasn't by car, and loved his wife so, I guess, possessively, that he never wanted to go anywhere or her to go anywhere without him, and he didn't want to go anywhere without her. And since he wouldn't travel on a plane or would only travel on a car, that limited them. And she even, for instance, didn't go to her first grandson's college graduation because it was on the other coast. He died. Guess who just recently came back from Ireland? This would be an example of blooming widows. We also see another pattern in grief, and I want to spend a little time talking about this. This is, among others, the work of George Bonanno. That we also see a pattern that we want to differentiate from transformation, or at least understand, called resilience. Some people have a relatively limited reaction to grief. Sometimes we see them in grief counseling because they're surprised by their lack of grief. And the part is situational. When you do the research on these resilient grievers, they tended to have fewer losses or other stress. They usually weren't experienced with a sudden death. They had a chance to say goodbye. They tended to have an intrinsic spirituality, however they defined that spirituality. They tended to have good psychological health. In other words, they didn't have a mental health history, particularly of anxiety or depression. And these people were relatively resilient. Loss was perceived by them as a challenge. As we did further research on this, and I love this cartoon, I know you probably can't read it here, But you see these three fishermen going down the gullet of a large fish. And one of them's open to beer, he's enjoying the trip. The other two are clearly chagrined. And this guy who's enjoying the beer says, still, you got to admit, our being swallowed by a fish has its humorous aspects. There's a man with resilience. They tended to have an optimistic mindset. They tend to respond to challenges. They had a belief that even in the worst ways, they could learn and they can grow. And they often focused on positive memories, really reviewing the positive memories of the person they loved and lost. So certainly one of the things we ought to be doing is promoting resilience. And how do we promote resilience? Well, naturally, it starts in childhood. And some of the factors that are associated with resilience are, the child is social and adaptable. He has characteristics valued by others and self. Good peer relationships, good problem-solving skills. A positive but yet realistic picture of self. A sense of control. Hopeful faith in the future that, that things will be okay. And the ability to seek out and solicit support. This is a really big one. A number of years ago, there came out a bunch of research in the 1970s on what were called invulnerable children. Any of you familiar with that research? Okay. These were children who were identified as quote-unquote invulnerable. We're going to change that in a minute. And one of the things about these kids is that they grew up in situations where all the outcomes should have been negative. They should be on the streets, they should be addicts, they should be in prison, except nobody ever told them, and they're now teaching at Harvard. And they really succeeded well. And so people began to study this, and they said, and one researcher said, isn't it interesting, in a study of a group of invulnerable children identified from a slum neighborhood in Toronto, Canada. He did this long-term study over years, and he said, all the invulnerable kids had the same first-grade teacher, and they all credited their success to the gifts that she gave them. Not physical gifts, but just the psychological gifts that she bestowed on them. Thought that was fascinating. And then later research came out. And you thought, well, isn't it nice that these kids had that opportunity? But the subsequent research said it's more complicated than that. These kids identified supportive adults in their environment and recruited them. Essentially cultivated their ways into their lives and had them take on the role of positive role models and mentors. It wasn't luck. It was skill. Isn't that fascinating? But that was their ability to get support. We also realize that there are family factors. They come from stable and supportive homes. They have an authoritative, not authoritarian, but an authoritative parenting style. What that means is that their parents were authoritarian, is that you get a lot of demands from your parents and very little support. Authoritative is that you have high demands placed on you, expectations placed on you, but at the same point, your parents are there giving you a lot of support. So they're helping you achieve your goals and assisting you as you do that. The parents were involved in education. Not unusually then, they tended to have higher social class, higher education levels. They tended, and again, look at intrinsic spirituality. They tended to have some kind of faith background, some kind of religious background, but not necessarily, they often define themselves as spiritual, not necessarily always as religious, but they define themselves as having a spirituality. They had a positive family relationship with the deceased. They had confidence, and their parents gave them a sense of confidence and a sense of competence, and they often came from extended families. Communities also played a role. They came from communities that were safe and resourceful. They came from good supportive schools. And they had accessible services, including. And this, these studies coincide so nicely with one of the biggest studies that have been shown about resilience and transformation, the Scott and White study, which was done at a Scott and White Medical Center in Texas, where they found, again, people who did well in grief generally had a lot of social support, absence of previous mental health history, fewer other losses, perceived low preventability. In other words, they didn't see that they could have done anything to prevent the death. Personal growth model. They saw some good resulting from the death, and we'll talk about that piece. They had a chance to say goodbye to the loved one. They had intrinsic spirituality. They had spontaneous positive memories of the deceased. So we're really beginning to understand what purports and what supports resilience. What is the relation of resilience to transformation or post-traumatic growth? Are resilient people more likely to experience post-traumatic growth? And the answer is, it depends. Depends on how you define the concepts. If one defines resilience as the ability to transform negative experiences, the answer, of course, is by definition, yes. But if you define transformation in line with Kaplan's definition, sense of post-traumatic growth, then they're less likely to do so, because they're going to weather the trauma well. So it's not going to be like this great turn. You kind of can look at it as this way. That the relationship, they both have the common ability to create something positive out of negative experience. I don't know if you see this cartoon. Here they are in the midst of a raging flood. And the wife says to the husband, "Will you shut up about how good the fishing is?" In resilience, this ability to make positive out of negative, to make lemonade out of lemons, is almost natural. Where Kaplan suggests that this is a period of tremendous growth for some people. And it looks like it's a curvilinear relationship. That again, little struggle or distress, limited growth. Some struggle, distress, possibilities for growth. Intense struggle and distress, again, may not be any growth or very limited. So we can see there are two different concepts, but they're interrelated and they're both interesting. And again, while resilience means an ability to bounce back, it doesn't preclude growth and change. And what are some of the changes that grief can create for us? Well, one is a great appreciation of life, relationship, and priorities. I've studied death and dying for 50 some odd years now, literally. And I often get the question, doesn't that, well, first of all, people look at you to see if I have horns or a tail or, some strange personal look to me, if I like hanging out at funeral homes or things like that, none of which is true. But if you ask me what it has done for me, it has made me aware of two things, intensely aware of two things, which I consider very positive in my life. One is I'm very aware of how things can change very, very quickly. And it makes me, anxious to do the things I want to do. There's a film, when I used to teach a death and dying course, there's a film called Death that I used to watch, used to show my class. And it's an actual picture of somebody dying at Calvary Hospital, palliative care hospital in the Bronx. And as this person is dying, his name is Albro Pearsall, he's a man in his 50s. He talks very bitterly about, that so many times he wanted to do something, but he always thought there'll be time for that. And what he ended up doing was cleaning his apartment. Whenever I saw that film, I had renewed energy not to clean my apartment, but to do what I really wanted to do instead. And I remember one time, I had another godson, Keith, who I'm very, any rappers here? Any students into rap? Okay. Keith, you may know as Concept One. Concept with a K and one spelled out. So he's had a moderate success as a kind of rapper. I bought all his albums. I haven't listened to one. But I love Keith dearly. And when Keith was about 10 years old, it was middle of November. We had an early snowstorm. I had just bought him, matter of fact, that was the trip he came up for. I had bought him a snowboard for his birthday, his first snowboard. And as soon as he saw the snow, he said, and this was mid-November, he said, let's see if any place is open. Let's go snowboarding tomorrow. Let's go skiing and snowboarding tomorrow. So I checked around, and the only place that was open, half a trail, just one single half a trail, was Bel Air on this side of the river. So he was anxious. We got there first thing in the morning. We were literally the first persons on the lift. And we're going up on the lift, and all of a sudden coming down the other side from a lift is a black bear. So Keith says, what do we do? I said, let's see what the bear does. I said, if the bear's standing there looking at us like this, we'll take the ride again. But as soon as the bear saw people on the lift, he ran back into the forest, so we got off. And we had a wonderful time. We skied pretty much back and forth till about 1 o'clock when the snow had basically kind of melted, and we were tired because there were probably about 100 people who were there. So we were having a great time. And when I get back, I have this neighbor who was since died, but was a really wonderful guy. And he looked at me, but very meticulous about his house. And he looked at me and he said, you never got to clean your driveway. And I said, and I couldn't help, I was so up from that event with Keith because Keith was so excited by it. I said, Jim, I said at that point in time, I said, I worked with dying people maybe about 15 years, 20 years. I've never heard anybody say, I should have cleaned the driveway. I said, I had an experience with my godson that he will remember for the rest of his life, that he will be telling his grandchildren about. So you get to appreciate the time and priorities. And you get to, and the other thing I've learned from my thing in the field is not to leave any unfinished business. So many times in grief counseling, you meet with people who regret something they've said or something they didn't say or something they did or something they failed to do at the appropriate moment. I always find that so difficult and so sad. And one of the things that I really try not to do is to have unfinished business. I'll give you 2 examples of that. When my son was about 10 years old, I was a single parent. I didn't realize how nervous he was when I went on trips when he was that young. He would stay with friends and he would stay with my sister. We always had safe places to stay. But one time he was being slow and I said, come on, Keith. I said, come on, Mike. I got a plane to catch. And he said, I hope the plane crashes. Just as an angry kid, nervous. And I looked at him and I laughed and I said, Michael, I said, sit down, let's take a minute and talk about it. I said, if anything happens to the plane, I said, trust me, you'll spend years in therapy. And he laughed at that and got a good kick at that, and then we were fine after that. The other thing that I'm remembering is whenever I finish a conversation with my son, my grandchildren now, my daughter-in-law, my family, I always say, Mission, I love you. And when Keith was a teenager, I'd say that to him, and when he was about 12 years old, 13 years old, and he would be embarrassed by it. He'd say, yeah, me too. And I'd say, what does me too mean? You miss you and you love yourself? That's good too. And then on 9/11, I got this call from him. And it was funny. It was 2 messages on my machine. First message said, call me if you're on a plane. Second message was, just call me. And then I got on the phone and I said, no, Keith, I said, I'm not on a plane today. He said, I was so scared because I know you fly a lot. And he said, and this is even hard to tell, he said, I kept thinking that the last conversation we had, your last words to me was, I miss you and I love you. And he said, I can say that now. So whenever I end a conversation with him and I say that to him, he repeats it back. You know, we can grow from grief. It changes us. We may grow in character. We may see ourselves as smarter or brighter or stronger than we ever believed we were. We have an existential awareness. We know that life is a gift and sometimes a very tentative one, right? We don't always know what's going to happen. We don't know what the future holds. We grow in skills. You know, I had one widow who came in one day very proudly saying, for the first time since my husband died, I balanced the checkbook. You know, another skill that, you know, that she had. It changes our lifestyle. And maybe it even renews our spirituality. I love this cartoon. There, Skylar, do you understand it now? But no, I'm confused on a much higher plane. When I first started working with dying children, I was seeking answers. Why are these lovely kids dying? And that was my first work at 23 years old in Sloan Kettering in the pediatric ward. And I never did find the answer to that, but I can live with the fact that I don't know the answer to that. You know, my spirituality has become, I don't know, more flexible, more understandable. I don't seek I don't think that I know all the answers. I always tell people, you should have had me as a therapist when I was 25 because I knew exactly what you should do. Now, not so much. Not so much. I'm confused on a much higher plane, though. I will grant you that. And grief counseling, studies have actually shown that clients will do better in groups and in individual counseling, we're finding out, when their counselors, their leaders have transformation rather than coping as the goal of therapy or support. In other words, we're really going to focus not just on getting you through this, but seeing what the opportunities for growth are beyond this. So how can we enhance transformation? Well, one is language. A number of years ago, I read an article by Larry Reynolds, a social worker from Long Island, that changed the way I approached grief counseling. Once I read that article, I used to have a widow and widowers group. I no longer led a widow and widowers group. That was the last one I read before I read that article. I led before I read that article. Then, after that article, I had a surviving spouses group. Think about the subtle difference in language. What do you have to do to be a widow or widower? Nothing. It happens to you. But when you're a surviving spouse, you've made a decision that you're going to go on, that you're going to persist. And Ginny Chapelier follows that and talks about using empowering language like challenge and courage and confidence rather than problems and difficulties and struggles. You know, what are the challenges you face rather than what are the problems you face? One of the things I got from Catherine Sanders is that small choices empower bigger ones. In other words, when we make small choices, ultimately we're going to have to make a choice, as Sanders says. Am I going to die? Am I going to just keep in this state of chronic grief? Or am I going to transform? Am I going to do something different with my life? And I always start by really, in my counseling, posing issues of choice. Really saying, even let's say in October, as you're approaching the holidays at the end of October, the winter holidays, Hanukkah, Christmas, Thanksgiving, I'll say, who do you choose to be with and what will you choose to do? And sometimes people will answer, well, I guess I'll go over to my sister-in-law's and I'll reinforce it. I'll say, is that where you choose to be? Because my notion is when you make people see them as active, see themselves as active, Later, when they get to that ultimate choice, am I going to die? Am I going to live? Am I going to stay the same? Or am I going to change? They've all had a history of making choices. Assist clients in developing a mission. That can be important, Talun and Taheshi say. In other words, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with this experience now? Many of you remember the story of John Walsh, who, when his son Adam died, really decided to make a mission out of helping people find missing children and helping people find unsolved crimes. And again, that became his mission. Examination of positive and negative adaptations. What I'm thinking of here is, and let's be honest, how many of you are counselors or do any kind of counseling? Okay. Somebody comes into you, let's say it's after the holidays, and you say, how did your choices go? How did the holiday go? And they talk about 7 things that went well and 1 thing that didn't go well. Now let's be honest. What are you going to focus on? The thing that didn't go well. Well, really, we can learn, and we should spend some focus on that, but really, what we should focus on are the positive examples. What went well? What worked? And how did it work? And how can you apply that in the future? In other circumstances? And how might you do this one poor choice you made, differently? Reflecting. How has this loss changed you? And then, at the appropriate time, and very, very carefully and very, very sensitively, we may ask the question, can you imagine what your life would be like, or what you might have become if this had not happened? Now, again, we don't want to be singing in therapy, walk on the sunny side of the street. Excuse me. But we want to, and I usually start this when the person begins to talk about positive changes that they've noticed. And I say, that's interesting. So you balance the checkbook for the first time. Have you noticed any other things that you're doing now that you couldn't do before? It's integrating it into the therapeutic experience, but really kind of helping them understand what they have gained and how they have grown. And again, there's value in benefit finding, in the experience of grief. It helps to create meaning. That's why organ donation, memorial scholarships can be important, and also to recognize the intangible benefits that people have had. The personal growth they've experienced, the insights and the awareness. What is the meaning of life? I don't know, the computers are down, but we have our meanings, and that's part of benefit finding. And again, people, even in support groups, one of the benefits that we find of people in support groups is not just the validation of their grief, not just giving them assistance for coping, not just giving them respite, but when people help others, this was some of the work of Dale Lund, they actually find they are doing better. And so we want to validate that to people. And again, I always really make a point of saying, though, in my support group, one of the rules is you can talk about what helped you, but you cannot give advice to somebody else. This is what you should do. Now, this is what you should not do, is tell people what they should do. But you can tell what helped you. And again, one of the things that I've begun to do in support groups when I led them was the first question we asked is, how has my story changed from the last time we were together? How has that changed? And again, this begins us to focus on what is learned, what are some new insights, what are some skills that have grown. Then one of the things that I do with my support group too, as a termination, I'll ask them, let's say termination is May 5th, 2024, and I'll say, suppose I meet you on May 5th, 2025, maybe just on the street. Maybe in a supermarket. And the reason I'm smiling is I always have one wise ass in my support group. One of the rules I have in my support group or with therapy is that I always tell people, if we are on the outside, I will not acknowledge you or recognize you unless you acknowledge me. And I always do that not because, not as an ego thing, but simply because I don't want somebody to explain, oh, that's my therapist, or he leads our support group, because it may involve sharing more than they're open to sharing. So, I give them control over that situation. And whenever I talk about this, I meet you in a year, somebody in the group always says, and we acknowledge you. And you acknowledge me. What will you answer me when I say, how are you doing? And I get all kinds of responses. Some of them may be sad ones. Nothing much has changed, but most of them are very positive. I want you to meet my new spouse, or I'm now a volunteer for hospice, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. So what we're really talking about here is strength-based grief counseling that focuses on personal strengths, that focuses on the strengths of significant others, that reviews strategies and solutions that worked in the past, that focuses on hopes for the future. I like to use what I call the Janus approach to grief counseling. You all know who Janus is? Janus is who January is named after. He's the Roman god of transitions. And he's a two-faced god. He looks forward and he looks backwards. He's the god of departures and arrivals. And this comes out of the work, partly out of the work of Catherine Sanders. So the first question is, what does this loss really mean to me? And what are the secondary losses that come with it? When I lose a person, I may lose other connections or other roles in my life. What is left? This really brings us to an important concept in grief and bereavement, which is probably about 40 years old now, but still very significant. That when somebody dies, we don't detach from that person. We keep a continuing bond with that person. They're part of our memories. They're part of our legacy. They're part of our biography. We may have experiences in which we dream of them or remember them. So what's left? What are the residues? And what are the strengths that I have, both internal and external? What do I bring to the table? And what are some of the things that my friends have? And here, and I think I have this on another slide, but I'll deal with it here. One of the techniques that I use, which I find incredibly successful with people, and so if you're counselors, you may want to adopt this, or even just in terms of self-help, is I sometimes will ask clients to make a list of all the people in their support system. And, and they bring in the list as homework, or you write the list yourself in your room. And then I say, okay, so these are your people that you look for support. This is your support system. You sure you have everybody on it? Everybody's on it. People at work maybe that should be on it that aren't. So we'll go through the list. And then I'll say, I want you to put a D next to all the people who are great doers. You need something done, you can count on them being done. When I used to travel a lot, I used to have my neighbor Jim, who I told you about, and I'd ask Jim to take in my mail. I could tell him I'm leaving on such and such a day and coming back on this day, and I could count on the fact that he had a key to my house, that my mail would be in a plastic bag waiting for me when I came back. Okay? He was a great doer. You'd put an L next to people who are good listeners. Call them at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're delighted you called them, and they're willing to listen to whatever you bring. Probably many of the people here, by nature of what brought you here, are good listeners, so you get an L. Most people, a lot of doers aren't necessarily good listeners. Jim was one of those, I could count on him. I knew if he had a heart attack bringing in my mail, he would write in blood on the driveway, take in Ken's mail. Leave it on the kitchen table. On the other hand, Jim was a terrible listener. If ever you told him a problem, he'd tell you 5 reasons that this problem should never have developed and 3 things you should do right away. Okay? There's a third letter, R. R are respite people. Grief is hard work. And like any kind of hard work, you need time away from it. And same with grief. So these are the people you go out with, You go to a restaurant, you laugh at a movie with them, and they're never going to, and sometimes this really annoys you, because they're never going to turn to you and say, how are you really doing? And that's their gift to you. And they're hoping against hope that you don't really talk about it. But that's their gift to you. Their gift is they give you time off from your grief, place away from your grief. And that's a great external strength. And whenever I do that with people, I find people realize, number one, they have a larger support system than they maybe thought they did. And number two, they're using it poorly. They're asking their listeners to do, they're asking their doers to listen. They're not getting things done, they're not getting heard, and they're just totally annoyed at the respite people who never talk about the loss. When they do that, it helps. Sanders would say, and this is how Sanders would terminate therapy, with asking 3 questions. After the loss, you're living a different life now. What do I want to bring from my old life into my new life? Maybe I want to bring some of the skills I had. Maybe I want to bring some of the sense of safety that I once had. What do I need to leave behind? Maybe some of my anger and guilt. And what do I need to add? Maybe I need to learn to balance a checkbook. By the way, I say that, and if you look at my checkbook has a column in it that at the end of each reconciliation period that says correction. And all I do is reconcile the statements by either adding or putting money that I can't find in the checkbook. My dad used to do that for me. And one of the models of grief that we have now is called the dual process model, very popular model, that and William Worden's task theory of grief. And what the dual process model says is that we have to deal with 2 major issues when we deal with grief. One is we have to deal with the loss and the impact of the loss. And the other process is that we have to, I don't like the term restoration, but essentially we have to adjust to life's changes and make sense out of life's changes and make those changes. And so struggle means that you oscillate, you move between the 2. Remember that woman I told you who said, I can balance the checkbook for the first time? The next week she came to me and she said, I realized if Tom hadn't died, I wouldn't have had to worry about that. You know, that ability to go back and forth, dealing with loss and then also dealing with restoration. And again, you know, that's what we're really talking about. Strength-based techniques for adolescents and children, if you're interested in using them, and you can adapt them to adults as well. This is one of the things that I like. It's called rock solid support. You get a couple of polished stones, get some paste, and then the kids create a page. They glue rocks on a page and put themselves in the center, and then they talk about who they look to for support. Maybe their parents, maybe their sibling, maybe their teacher. And it's a way that they can understand, even as I'm grieving, I still have some rock-solid support. Give yourself a hand is another technique. So you trace out both hands. One hand, you talk about your external strengths. The other hand, you talk about your internal strengths. I've never done these with adults, but as I stand here today, I can't think why. They might be good techniques. Another one is a shield or a first aid kit. What's going to help you through your grief? And this is Mountains of Strength, where kids keep writing down everything they've learned in their grief groups, kind of creating 2 mountains out of 2 pieces of paper, placed into another one, and we always ask the parents, you know, do something special when they complete 1 mountain. Some kids will make a range. And of course, we want to empower families. Children's grief takes place in a family context, so how does the family talk about grief? Full expression of feelings. And again, here's something that came out of the childhood bereavement study, one of the best studies and biggest studies that's ever been done on children and bereavement. It was done by William Worden and Phyllis Silverman and Nickman a number of years ago. And the only reason I smile on that is whenever I talk about that, is I couldn't think of two people, both brilliant, both insightful. Phyllis is dead now, Phyllis Silverman, who I would never choose to have worked together. And as Bill later said, it was a match made in hell. Their just working styles were very different, but the work they came out of was just wonderful. But anyway, what they found is when you looked at the outcomes for children, the only thing that really was most significant, or the thing that was most significant and really overrode all the other factors, was if the surviving parent or parents function well, the child functioned well. So a lot of people in building resilience and building transformation in children have really made it a point. There's going to be a children's group, but their parents are going to meet in another group as well at the same time. Because if we don't deal with the family as system, we're not going to really have the success that we want. And again, sometimes we can pull an extended family. Intimate networks, to me, I define that as the group of people we care about and the group of people that care about us. Some of which are kin, and some of which are not kin. But, I hate the word fictive kin, that we sometimes use. Because they're family in a very real way. And again, remember always that we want to work with cultural and individual considerations. Don't underestimate people's abilities, and be willing, if you're going to do this, to explore their spiritual or religious views, because they're going to be part of this. And I want to give you, before I finish, and we have a little time for questions, I want to give you the final advice from no better author than Winnie the Pooh. I think he's a good conclusion. This is what Winnie the Pooh says. If ever there is a tomorrow when we're not together, there is something you always must remember. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if we're apart, I'll always be with you. Thank you very much. I never like to stand between people and dessert, but I think we have